The International Association for Near-Death Studies presents NDE Radio, a weekly exploration of near-death experiences and similar encounters with the other side. Now, here's your host, Lee Witting.
Welcome to NDE Radio, brought to you by IANDS, the International Association for Near-Death Studies. I'm your host, Lee Witting. Most listeners to this show already understand that near-death experiences are not the product of anesthesia or optic nerve damage or the hallucinations of the dying brain. The evidence is overwhelming that our eternal essence, call it our soul, leaves the dying body and travels to another place, a place often described in terms of incredible beauty, enlightened beings, and love. At the same time, such experiences can be remarkably personal, in that generations of family members may be there to greet us, not to mention our own religious icons such as Jesus, and opportunities to uncover the nature and purpose of love seem to abound. People often return to their bodies with a distinct impression that this world is but a shadow of the spiritual reality they have seen on the other side. Where do we go with what an NDE teaches us? Almost universal is the realization that the NDEer no longer fears death. Moreover, they may have gained a heightened capacity to love and care for others, as well as an enlarged perspective on how best to use their time. But is there a theological understanding of what the near-death experience has to say? Where is the spiritual home on earth for the near-death experiencer? Most traditional religions don't want to talk about it, or any form of personal mystical experience for that matter. The holy books are full of such stories, of course, and those stories are open to discussion. But personal mystical experiences, spiritually transformative experiences, visions, healings, prophecy from a relative or the neighbor down the street, your average minister or priest will probably tell you that has to be a psychological aberration. And yet, NDEers know in their hearts God is still talking to us. Our guest today, Robert Perry, is a scholar who has explored the link between personal mystical experience and the universal spiritual understanding we traditionally call theology. Robert is the lead editor of the new complete and annotated edition of A Course in Miracles, which is based on the original handwritten notes of Helen Schucman, the visionary we'll be talking about in a minute. Robert is one of the course's teachers as well, and currently lives in England. He's the founder of the Circle of Atonement, has authored or co-authored over 20 books and booklets on the course, as well as hundreds of articles, including an article he co-authored about near-death experiences and A Course in Miracles for IANDS Journal of Near-Death Studies, Volume 32, Number 4, which came out in the summer of 2014. Robert has also lectured throughout the U.S. and internationally. So, Robert, welcome to NDE Radio.
I'm so honored to be here.
Well, we're honored to have you. Robert, let's begin with Helen Schucman's subway vision and how the Course in Miracles came out of that.
Did I just welcome you, Lee?
Well, sure.
Okay, what was your question?
That vision that Helen Schucman had in the subway might have been some sort of spiritually transformative experience that ultimately led to her becoming the scribe to Jesus, as she believed it happened. So I thought maybe you could tell us that story.
It's a fascinating story. Helen ultimately became a research psychologist, but throughout her life, she wrestled with the issue of God and was prone to various kinds of unusual, even spiritual experiences. And perhaps the most remarkable and profound one happened when she was probably around 30. This would be in the late 1930s. And she was riding the subway, which she was not accustomed to doing. And apparently a taxi was not available at the time. Her husband more or less forced her to ride the subway, which she considered beneath her. And she found herself repulsed by the various people on the subway. You know, they were messy and sweating, And she was so repulsed that she closed her eyes to shut the scene out. And when that happened, she had this vision spring up behind her closed eyes. She saw an image of herself as a child walking into this brilliant light. And what the child then did was first prostrate herself before the light. Then she got up, walked toward the light as if it was a completely familiar thing, completely comfortable. And then she saw the child kneel down and lean her head as if against a giant knee. Even though there was no hard shape, there was a sense of a knee. Mm-hmm. And then she had a sense of an outline of a great arm reach around her in an embrace. And then the child disappeared into the light. The light grew incredibly bright. Waves of it came out towards Helen. And with these waves, there was an incredibly intense sense of love. It was so intense that she felt like she had to escape from that scene. She opened her eyes, and of course now she's back seeing the same, grimy subway scene that she'd seen before, only now she felt incredible love. The love that she felt from the light, she felt towards all those people she'd been repulsed by just a moment earlier. And then it faded, and everything returned to normal. And she mentioned it to her husband sitting next to her, and he said, "Oh, it sounds like a common mystical experience. Pay no attention to it." And she tucked it away for many years.
Wow. Did she ever think that perhaps as a child she'd had a near-death experience? There might not even have been that kind of language for it back in the 1930s. But did she ever wonder about the origin of that? Was it a current event, and she was just saw herself as a little child being taken into God's light, or?
I don't think, well, first of all, she died in 1981, just a few years after NDEs reached public consciousness. So I don't think she thought in those terms at all. And I'm not aware of any experience she had as a child, like a medical emergency or, she momentarily was clinically dead. I'm not aware of anything like that. I think the child was just symbolic of, the innocence within her.
Okay. That makes sense, as well. As I mentioned before the show, I downloaded a short summary of the teaching of A Course of Miracles, which is available on your Circle of Atonement website. Mm-hmm. And it lists, A Course in Miracles offers a unique approach to the healing of human suffering, following an educational versus religious model of learning. The Course provides a pathway out of our suffering through the disciplined practice of love and forgiveness. Can't go wrong with that. And the following provides a very brief overview of the Course's profound and sophisticated thought system. And as a matter of fact, I should mention that years ago my brother decided to buy the first book in the series, and he said it was so dense that he couldn't get through it. Mm-hmm. He told me that story the other day. Now, that was before you did your revision, I guess. But anyway.
Well, it's not the easiest book to understand.
Yes.
And I probably should just tell a little bit about the origin of it just before we dive into the teachings, if that's
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes, I meant to ask you about that.
Yeah, so Helen went on, as I mentioned, to become a research psychologist. She worked with a colleague, Bill Thetford, who became integral to the birthing of A Course in Miracles. And she worked with him at Columbia University, specifically at the College of Physicians and Surgeons and also the Presbyterian Hospital there in New York City. And they worked for about 7 years together and had a very contentious relationship. In fact, all of their relationships within the psychology department that they worked with other medical centers, other departments, it was just conflict everywhere. And finally in 1965, Bill, before a particularly difficult meeting that they had regularly, made a kind of pre-planned speech to Helen in which he said, essentially, there must be a better way. And he proposed that they try out a way in which they would essentially try to cooperate rather than compete, look for the best in people, point out the positive, essentially try to get along. And Helen, surprisingly, decided that she would join him in this, and they knew, even though this was not a spiritual event by any normal definition, and that nothing mystical happened, they knew it was some kind of life-changing moment. And it seemed to trigger, it did end up transforming their department and their professional lives, but at the same time it triggered this other stream of results where Helen began having inner visions and also paranormal, like psychic experiences. And these inner visions were fascinating. They pictured her in various past times. Many of them featured a mysterious book that kept showing up. One time the book was brought by a stork. Another time the book, she unearthed a treasure chest from the bottom of a canal. And when she opened the treasure chest, all that was in it was this book. So she was having this series of interesting experiences in dreams. She tried to meditate. It happened then. And all of this culminated in about 4 months to a moment when she heard an inner voice, which had been showing up here and there in her inner visions. But this inner voice said, "This is a course in miracles. Please take notes." And so she began to take down shorthand notes in her notebooks, recording what this voice said. And it began dictating a series of miracle principles. And slowly, an entire voluminous spiritual teaching came out of this process over a period of about 7 years. What first came out was a volume called The Text, and it's the longest part of A Course in Miracles. Then came a workbook, which has basically a series of lessons, one for each day of the year, and instructions for very detailed spiritual practice. And then the third volume was called A Manual for Teachers, intended for those who've gone through the text and the workbook and will now take on some kind of role, at least as demonstrations of the principles in the world. And so the course itself consists of 3 volumes, text, workbook, and manual for teachers. And it's essentially a spiritual program in higher development, focusing on the teaching of forgiveness, which it interprets in its own particular way. But that's its central focus, is forgiveness. And it is the course is very sophisticated, not easy to follow. And that's essentially why I have a job, because I'm an interpreter of the material. I try to help students understand it and apply it in their lives.
Mm. Now, she believed that she was being given this course by Jesus. Is that correct?
She believed that, and that's how the voice spoke. And it is a very controversial claim. I think a lot of course students accept it, but also there's a certain sense of we don't want to get too much into that Jesus figure because we associate him with traditional religion, and which many course students have felt, somewhat scarred by. For myself, I think it's a fascinating claim to take seriously, because there are some really interesting parallels between the author of A Course in Miracles, whoever he was or whoever it was, and the historical Jesus as uncovered by modern scholarship.
Yeah. Well, perhaps we could get into the short summary, unless there's something more you wanted to add to the development, how this evolved.
I think that's probably sufficient. Yeah, just a sense of the course is both a book and a spiritual path.
Okay. Well, the first topic is simple one: God.
Right.
And you say everything begins with God. How does the course understand God?
Well, one of the things that I find really fascinating is the more I understand the Course's teachings about God, the more incredibly similar the God of A Course in Miracles sounds to the God that NDEers experience in their NDEs. So God is ultimately, non-physical, of course, beyond gender, not really male or female, I guess both. God is the creator. God is alive, aware, has a will, has thoughts, has feelings. And yet, in the Course, God is absolutely pure love. Not a hint of judgment or anger or wrath. And so God, from the standpoint of A Course in Miracles, is an absolutely safe, loving, attractive being that we feel an attraction to at our core innately. And in fact, one of the things that fascinates me about NDEs in relation to A Course in Miracles is that you often hear stories in someone's NDE where they see the light, which is, most often described as God, and they feel this incredible attraction towards the light, and they feel themselves going towards the light because of this attraction. And the Course talks about something very similar in terms of what it calls the pull of God, this overwhelming pull we feel towards God that is innate in our nature.
Mm-hmm. Does the Course acknowledge that there is a part of God in us as well as, and perhaps in all aspects of the material world? I mean, is there a notion of an infused consciousness in existence?
Oh, very much so. Yes. What the Course teaches is that God, and this is a very unusual teaching, is that God creates only spiritual realities. So from the Course's standpoint, He created each one of us, but not as humans with bodies, but as limitless spiritual beings who partake in God's nature, who are inherently one with God. And it's the Course's teaching that that's our true nature. And then we went through a process of falling asleep to that and then experiencing ourselves as human beings. So it's not so much that we have an element of God in us. It's that in our true nature, we're in a sense made of God's nature. He created us out of His own nature. So we're completely spirit and completely divine.
Which would mean there should be a tremendous attraction between us and God. And,
right.
Of course, that love is I guess the way we give voice to that or put a quality to it. If that's the case, then how does the Course deal with the question of free will? Does it see that we have it? I mean, does it, or is it something that we are just fooling ourselves into thinking we have?
Yeah, the Course does teach that we have free will, and that the process of choice is just central to our experience. We are here on Earth to learn how to choose rightly, and basically that's how we got here in the first place. The Course sees that, or teaches that, there was a primordial separation whereby we used our power of free will to turn away from God, and to fall into a dream of being apart from God. The Course says we can't be apart from God. We're all in God right now. We're not really in this world, in these bodies. We're just dreaming that we're here. But it's our use of free will that got us in this dream, and then it's meant to be our use of that same free will that ultimately chooses our way out of this.
Okay, now we've jumped into this interesting topic of the world as a dream.
Right.
If the world we live in is a dream, what responsibilities do we owe to it, being only a dream, and also to one another?
It's a good question. From the Course's standpoint, the forms of the world are figures in a dream. The bodies, the physical objects, the things in nature, but associated with those forms, especially like human bodies and animals and so on, are those God-created minds that are really divine, that are really limitless, that are really with God and in God right now, and are themselves dreaming. So it's not just that it's all unreal. The mind that we are is real. The mind that other people are is real. The minds that are in animals and even plants and all those things are real. And so there is a responsibility towards those minds. They have value. They're part of God. They're ultimately part of us too. And so from the Course's standpoint, we have a tremendous responsibility in this world. In fact, when, the title is A Course in Miracles, the main sense of that title is that a miracle is an expression of love. We're here to give miracles, which means express love to others so that we have a healing and illuminating and loving effect on them.
Mm. Now, NDEers often see heaven as a perfect world, as an Eden, basically. Beautiful forests and fields and flowing streams and flowers that are luminescent. They're so alive with love. But I think I heard in one of the lectures that, or maybe the conversation you had with Corinne in that YouTube, that the lower heavens are formless and they're a dream as well.
Okay, yeah. So from the Course's standpoint, what it calls heaven would be the very, very highest level in which there is no form, there are no bodies, there's no forests, there's no flowers. It's just pure oneness. And there, in that heaven, there is some kind of distinction between us and God and between us and each other, but it's a distinction within oneness. And so the kind of afterlife, I think that would correspond really to when people are when NDEers are just immersed in the light, when there's just nothing but them in the light. That would be like what A Course in Miracles calls heaven. When you have the more, idealized earth kind of afterlife experiences in NDEs, the Course would say that those are still a collective dream. And I think that there's some sense that that's the case where, there are some NDEs, for instance, where it's clear that those environments are malleable depending on the mind, that they're in some sense mind created. So the Course would see those as still a level of the dream, a higher level than this earth, but still part of some larger kind of dream. However, there is a parallel. There's just such a number of amazing parallels, in my view, between A Course in Miracles and NDEs. And one of them is about those afterlife environments, because as you mentioned, the flowers are often alive with some kind of consciousness and often seen as or experienced as loving the NDEer, where everything in the environment is actively loving that NDEer. Mm-hmm. And that's very much like what A Course in Miracles calls the real world. It talks about this concept, the real world, where even in this world, if we could really open our eyes, our spiritual eye, you could say, we would see this world that way. We would realize that there is a consciousness in everything that, regardless of how, it may look on the surface or even feel towards us on the surface, is actually divine and is actually loving us. Mm. So if we saw the real world in this world, we would experience it very much like NDEers experience those afterlife realms that you talked about.
Some of those descriptions parallel people's experiences on LSD and ayahuasca. Unfortunately, those aren't typically available for psychological and spiritual exploration. They've become, a way of wasting time and wasting lives. But the power to change their perspective on something like the consciousness of a flower is probably available to us through meditation, if not through LSD, and
through all kinds of means.
Yeah, and it is there. All we have to do is work at it. It's too bad it doesn't come more easily, but then perhaps we wouldn't value it so highly when we do see it.
And I think those experiences are more common than perhaps we realize, but it's also why I think we should value people like Helen Schuckman, like NDEers, who have had glimpses of something more.
Yes. Well, spiritually transformative experiences can come from anywhere at any time, including psychedelics. I know people who have changed their lives for the better on the account of that.
Sure, and some very serious and spiritually oriented work is being done with them these days.
Yes, they're beginning now at Johns Hopkins. They're working with LSD again and some other things to open up that part of the brain that's or normally closed down. St. Paul said he went to the third heaven in his NDE, which was described as the Garden of Eden. And this garden idea is so powerful in NDEs and so personally rewarding that you'd almost think it would turn people off to think that that's a dream as well. Do you get that kind of reaction from your students?
At times, I think most of my students aren't thinking so much in terms of what do we think about, afterlife experiences. I think, though, that if we imagine that, life in this world, which we're very familiar with, can be very difficult. It's why you have so many NDEers, for instance, saying, I don't want to go back. And then, you get to a realm like those afterlife environments that's so much happier and more joyful and peaceful and loving. And if we can imagine that progression not stopping there, but it just keeps going and going and going so that the joy and the peace and the love keep, becoming more and more unbounded and more without limit, then we can think, well, it's not like taking away the forms is a deprivation. It's actually a case where it means that what we really want, the joy and the peace and the love, is simply becoming less bounded.
Yes. Well, Robert, I'm afraid we're out of time for today, but you have agreed to come back for our next show, and we're going to pick up the conversation from where we're leaving off right now. My thanks to you for today, Robert, for sharing the story of, Helen's story for sure, and the story of this Course in Miracles as well. And we'll pick it up next week. Robert, tell our audience how they can find out more about the Course and how to find your website.
Yes, the website the organization is the Circle of Atonement, which is a term from the Course, and the website is short for Circle of Atonement.org, and you can learn there more about A Course in Miracles, more about the new edition that we've published based on Helen's shorthand notes, and just more about our teachings and offerings.
Terrific. We'll pick this up next week. If you'd like to listen to this show again or any of our past shows, just go to our website at nderadio.org. For information on IANDS, check out their website at IANDS.org. And join us again next Monday, 11 a.m. Eastern, for more NDE Radio. This is Lee Witting saying thanks for listening.